Okay, folks, we're back again, and this time we're looking at part three of the Cumann government between 22 and 1932. That's the W.T. Cosgrave administration. But continuing on from Anglo-Irish relations, we're just going to do another paragraph of content here on the Free State as a dominion, the Free State's position in the wider world. And as part of the Anglo-Irish Treaty terms, the Irish Free State had now attained dominion status within the British Commonwealth. That meant that they were still part of the British Commonwealth. They still took an oath of allegiance to the king and were still kind of tied in many respects in relation to the constitution, etc. Other countries were also dominions such as Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, but of course geographically and economically we were far closer linked to Britain than these countries. Anyway, that didn't stop Cosgrave and Cumann from getting small steps towards independence. This is nothing like the De Valera tactics that we will see in the Fianna Fáil chapter next. But they did get some little concessions, shall we say. One including, for example, Ireland joining the League of Nations as the Irish Free State as its own separate entity. Okay, and that was something that kind of ruffled a few British feathers, but they still were able to join that and have their own seat on the table. That was the forerunner to the United Nations. That was the League of Nations. Also, in October of 1924, they appointed their own very first ambassador, a diplomatic ambassador to the United States, a guy called T.A. Smitty. Small but slight, little steps forward, I suppose, in making us that independent. Ireland also played an active role in the imperial conferences. These were held every 2 years, which included Britain and all the other members of the Commonwealth. They would meet on matters of common interest, trade, cultural links, etc. And I suppose the culmination of that would have been the Statute of Westminster. This was work that was carried out by Desmond Fitzgerald, the Minister for External Affairs, and also Kevin O'Higgins would have put in a bit of groundwork as well prior to his assassination in 1927. But the Statute of Westminster is an extremely important part to be aware of. And this is so important, especially for anything on Anglo-Irish relations, anything on De Valera's strengths and weaknesses as a leader, and also going into the Fianna Fáil government of 32 onwards as well. So you need to become very familiar with this. This was, I suppose, a new bill that was passed that would apply to all members of the Commonwealth. Firstly, it said that no law made hereafter in the United Kingdom would extend to the dominions without their consent. In other words, if there was any law passed in Westminster on any particular issue, it didn't necessarily have to by default become law in countries like the Irish Free State and others. Secondly, the parliaments of the dominions, such as Dublin, now had full power to make their own laws in relation to foreign policy. But mostly, and most important of all, was the third element, which meant that the dominions now had the power to repeal or amend any previous acts passed by Westminster. So basically, they could go back, change laws that were passed by Westminster, which would affect Ireland, and also they could also amend previous laws. Repeal them, get rid of them. Okay, and this would prove to be massively important for De Valera when he becomes Taoiseach and begins dismantling the treaty from 1932 onwards. Cosgrave wouldn't exactly of that, but it would essentially be the beginning of the end in many respects of British involvement in Irish Free State affairs. And by 1937-38, we are essentially a 26-county republic, all but a name. And that was very much down to De Valera's Anglo-Irish policy and the way he utilised the Statute of Westminster to the nth degree. And Cosgrave himself was not able to avail of this, and I don't think he ever foresaw that De Valera coming in 3 months later would really utilise that whole clause about repealing and amending the acts. In other words, it basically gave De Valera the legal and constitutional basis to go back and revisit the treaty and dismantle it step by step. And we'll get to that in the Fianna Fáil chapter. Okay, so we're making a distinct change here now, folks. We're going on to Cumann nGaedheal, economic and social policy. This is certainly a question that I'll be keeping an eye out for this year's paper. A question on society and economy would normally go between 23 and 39. That would involve both Cumann nGaedheal and Fianna Fáil. And it could also go up into 1945, which would include a little bit about society and economy during World War II, which we'll get to in 2 chapters' times. We're going to look at just briefly here about economic independence, and then the primary focus will be on agriculture. The issue of tariffs we'll mention, and then industry, which incorporates the whole Shannon Scheme itself. Okay, when I use the question mark there after economic independence, I suppose I'm putting it out there rhetorically that Although we were now essentially separate from Britain politically to a certain extent, economically we were still very, very closely linked to Britain. 92% of our imports came from Britain, 93% of our exports went to Britain. But we were on our own, okay? We did have to kind of deal with serious issues such as partition. The industrial northeast was gone, and that was obviously a major obstacle to establishing our own economic independence. But there was some support from the banks in Ireland, large farmers as well, and the wealthy Anglo-Irish community that were helpful towards, I suppose, balancing the books. I used the word conservative in the first part of these videos, and conservative economic policy certainly is a big part of Ernest Blythe, the Minister for Finance at the time, his policy. There was also still a very close link to sterling. That was the currency that was used in Ireland even after independence, right up until 1927, when then we had the Currency Act, which established our own currency called the Irish punt, or the pound, and that was very much still closely linked in with the English time itself. So Blythe and Cosgrave adopt a very rigid and conservative policy. It's all about balancing the books, reducing public expenditure, reducing taxation, which would normally benefit the wealthier classes, the bigger farmers, the professional classes, who traditionally would have voted for Cumann na nGaedheal and later, as they were called, Fine Gael. So with that, I suppose those that were depending on public expenditure suffered as a result. Small farmers, those in looking for public housing, etc. And of course, most notoriously of all was that Ernest Blythe cut the old age pension, which proved to be very, very unpopular for him. And when Fianna Fáil came in, that was one of the first things that they sought to address, and traditionally would always see themselves as being a party that looked after the more vulnerable, including the old age pensioners. There was also a big upsurge in immigration and unemployment throughout the 1920s. And there you can see Ernest Blythe. This is a figure you need to know in a question relating to economic and social policy, as he was the Minister for Finance in this first government. Okay, so we mentioned there as well, as I said, there was a close relationship still existing with Britain. And, during the Great Economic Depression, or the World Economic Depression following the Wall Street crash, we were not as affected by the wider world because we were so closely linked to Britain. For that later on. Okay, if you got a question on society and economy, you could approach it thematically. And what I mean by that is you could maybe in an introductory paragraph talk about the state of the Irish economy around 22, 23, and then focus on agriculture. In other words, a paragraph on Cumann na nGaedheal agriculture. You could follow that up with down a paragraph on Fianna Fáil agriculture. Or you could go chronologically. For example, you could do paragraph 2 on Cumann na nGaedheal agriculture, paragraph 3 on Cumann na nGaedheal industry, and then go into the Fianna Fáil agricultural and industrial policies that followed. So at the time, agriculture was the dominant industry in Ireland. Some 670,000 farmers engaged in the practice itself. And Cumann na nGaedheal were very much, I suppose, linked to that and maybe put so much emphasis on industry. The Minister for Agriculture at the time, again, a name you should time, and some of his policies including bettering the standards for production. I suppose one of the issues for Irish farming was during World War I, we were exporting massive amounts to Britain to feed them for the war effort. And at times, maybe standards were quite poor and anything at all was being passed. So after the war, maybe customers became a little bit more choosy, and Hogan sought to try and better the quality and production of Irish farming produce. The Farm Advisory Service also increased its role as well to try and help farmers and assist farmers in new, more productive and better methods of farming. To assist this, they also set up a semi-state body called the ACC Bank, or the Agricultural Credit Corporation, and this was there to essentially provide finance and credit to farmers should they need. For example, loans would normally be around 100 Irish pounds for things like new machinery, refurbishment, extensions to farm holdings, etc. And yet few farmers seem to have taken advantage of this crime. In relation to land purchase, the 1923 Hogan Land Act also pretty much brought an end to the whole issue of landlords and tenants in Ireland. The landlords, which had been a big, big part of Irish farming for, I suppose, centuries, by the 1920s were essentially all but gone, in that all farmers now, going back to the 1870s, the Land Acts of Gladstone and those that followed, were essentially now able to take out loans and pay back these land annuities to the British government and later the Irish government. Fourthly, then, quite an unpopular consequence of Ernest Blythe's decision to cut taxes was also a decrease in government expenditure in agriculture, falling from 42 million to 24 million pounds. Again, in an economic question, you should put in the odd few percentages, pound signs, statistics, etc., because that would certainly be factual content. This had a big impact on the smaller farmers in particular who were dependent on government support. The larger farmers were quite happy with low taxation. They were the ones that were voting for Cumann na nGaedheal. The smaller farmers were now turning their votes towards the newly emerging Fianna Fáil party from 1926. And pretty much brings us to the whole issue of agriculture. Again, a paragraph on that would be sufficient. In relation to tariffs, Cumann na nGaedheal are not as obsessed with the whole area of tariff protection. Tariffs are essentially taxes on imports coming into your country itself. Some felt this was good in order to protect Irish industries and stuff. Others would have been against this. We'd say, for example, your small companies like Jacob's Biscuits in Dublin would have liked to have tariffs on foreign biscuits, in other words, to encourage the Irish market to buy Irish, whereas a big company, export-oriented like Guinness, would not have been in favour of this idea of tariff protection. They were into a more liberal, laissez-faire, open market policy of free trade. So Cumann na nGaedheal themselves were not too obsessed with the issue. If come to tariffs, they could apply for it, and a fiscal inquiry committee was established in 1923, and they would essentially put tariffs on small industries in Ireland, or sorry, competitors to small industries such as confectionery, soaps, shoes, etc. The Tariff Commission was set up then to essentially look at these case by case, and most companies, as I said, in Ireland were probably small and would have welcomed protection at the time, but the bigger companies did not. It didn't have any major implications for industry in terms of advantage because only 5,000 jobs were created in industry in the following 4 years. So Cumann na nGaedheal, not so obsessed with tariff protection. If you're doing a comparison with Fianna Fáil, you'll see very much in the next chapter how De Valera was very much geared towards that whole market. Okay, in relation to industry, one of the big successes of this government, and this would apply to a question on both Cosgrave, Cumann na nGaedheal, economic policy, you should certainly write a paragraph on the Shannon Scheme. This was basically bringing electricity to all of Ireland. Up to this point, it was only urban areas as such had electrical appliances and access to electricity. But an Irish engineer called T.A. McLaughlin, who had spent some time in Germany, had come back to Ireland and essentially contacted Cosgrave and proposed the idea of utilising the River Shannon and creating a hydroelectric plant near Ardnacrusha in County Limerick, thus creating the Shannon Scheme. So after a year of working on this, he came back and Cosgrave gave it the green light. This was not typical of the Cosgrave Conservative policies of the decade, but it was certainly a major success. And any question on Cosgrave, Cumann na nGaedheal, or the economy should certainly be flagging this as one of the great successes of this particular period in Irish history. With the assistance of the German company Siemens and engineers that came over from there, and over 4,000 Irish workers, they began this massive project of essentially rerouting the River Shannon, creating a hydroelectric power station, a dam, which in turn would create enough electricity to essentially electrify Ireland. 5 years to achieve. The Minister for Industry and Commerce at the time, Patrick McGilligan, who succeeded Joe McGrath after the Army Mutiny, oversaw this, and some, as I said, 4,000 Irishmen were involved in the construction of this. A semi-state body called the ESB was also set up in 1927, and this essentially established a national grid and began to, bring electricity right across itself in the following years that followed. By 1929, it was complete, and by 3 years later, in 1932, some 132 million kilowatts of electricity were now being produced. And this was certainly a successful merger of foreign investment and expertise from Germany, along with state intervention, and had huge, not just economic, but social benefits. And by that, essentially, Ireland is pretty much electrified, and that transforms the lives of everyone. And there you can see the Shannon Scheme itself at Ardnacrusha, which is still in use to this day, providing quite a lot of Ireland's electricity needs, and can certainly be seen as a major success of the Cumann na nGaedheal Free State Cosgrave government. Okay, we're going to pause here. We're going to conclude this chapter in the next section, in part 4, where we'll continue on with economic policy and then recap on some of the exam questions.